Yeah, so thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to speak to the group today. As Isto said, I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Scholarly Communications Lab in Canada, where I am working on a new project called the Meaningful Data Counts Project with a great team that's led by Stephanie Haustein and Isabella Peters. And we also work with Dr. Anton Ninkov on the project, where we're trying to learn more about practices of data citation and reuse. And at the same time, as you can see on this screen, I'm also a research fellow at Dans in the Netherlands, which is where I have spent the last 4 years of my career working on my PhD. So I'll talk about both of those lines of work today, as well as talking about something new that I've been thinking about. So I'll just make sure I can advance my slides here, which is not working for some reason. There we go. All right, so while the topic of the talk today is on disciplinarity, I'm actually going to start somewhere different, but we'll look at disciplinarity through kind of 3 different issues or questions, as well as 3 different perspectives. But first, we'll begin by talking about interdisciplinarity, mostly as a way of introducing myself a bit more to the group and as a way to kind of start engaging with this new topic. So my academic training is what you could call diverse, I think would be a good word for it. I have bachelor's degrees in neuroscience and a background in chemistry, but then I also have master's degrees in education and library and information science. And as of spring 2021, yay, I also have a PhD in STS and science and technology studies, where my work investigated how researchers across different disciplinary domains discover, find, understand, and use data which they don't create themselves. So I've also, across all of these different degrees, worked in many different roles in my career. I've been a teacher, I've been a librarian, I've been a researcher, I've worked at a data archive, and in all of those different roles, I have used different research methods, quantitative and qualitative, such as surveys and interviews and bibliometric analysis, which I mentioned because I will come back to all of those in the talk here. But the breadth of my own interdisciplinarity is made visible here on this craft work, this beautiful craft work, which was made by my PhD supervisor, Sally Wyatt, which represents the references I cited in my own dissertation. So she calls it kind of a knitted web of science, where the different colors of yarn that we see here actually represent the different disciplines for the works that I cited in the dissertation. So you could say that these different disciplines, these colors are knitted in what Sally calls the usual order, where we start with the largest first. So that's the green that you see on the side, that represents information science. And then the other colors represent different disciplines, such as the natural and the life sciences, computer science, STS, libraries and archives, but the colors also, some of them, represent different subjects, such as FAIR data or open data, or literature related to methods. But that's not all this beautiful craft work has to say. We also see these buttons scattered across it, where the larger of the buttons represent the disciplinary expertise of my supervisors. I did have 3 supervisors, so you see 3 buttons there. And then the little white buttons represent me. They represent the areas where I have actually published my work during the last 4 years. So this type of interdisciplinarity in my own work that we see here makes it really challenging for me to select just one discipline to describe my own academic interests and my own academic work. And we can see here that I am actually not alone in having this problem. This graph is from a global survey that we conducted, which had nearly 1,700 responses. And the survey aimed to investigate data discovery practices, so how researchers are finding data to use that they don't create themselves. And we asked the respondents to select the disciplines which they identified with to describe their expertise. So here we see that more than 50% of those survey respondents actually selected 2 or more disciplines. And we see that there were kind of usual overlaps, where we represented here by the lines on this graph, between, for example, biology and medicine. But then there were other types of interdisciplinarity, for example, where people would select social sciences and environmental sciences, or the arts and humanities and computer science. So we see that there are different ways of kind of being interdisciplinary for a person. But we also found during the course of this 4-year PhD project that there are different ways of doing interdisciplinary research on a team. So we found on our team that one of the things that kind of anchored and ground our work was having a shared term, a shared word that meant very different things in our different disciplines and had been studied in different ways. And for us, that term was use and users, which had been studied very differently in computer science versus in science and technology studies. But despite those differences, this term kind of acted as a bridge between all of us and between our own differences. And I would argue that these kind of conceptual bridges don't exist just in interdisciplinary work, but they also exist within disciplines. So my PhD work, but also the work of other people, including Christine Borgman comes to mind, has shown that there's a lot of variation, not only between disciplines, but also within a particular discipline when it comes to data practices. So just one nice example of this is a researcher who I spoke with in one of my interview studies. This person was a member of different biomedical communities. So he worked as a clinician at a hospital in Europe, but then he was also working in the United States at a research lab where he was investigating how to fuse spinal cords together. But each of these different biomedical communities that he's a member of was using data in different ways for different purposes. They had different policies about data sharing and data reuse. And some of those, of course, were also influenced by the location of where he was doing his work in which country. But the practices and norms of these different communities that he was a part of were sometimes in conflict, and he had to kind of adapt his own individual practices based on the different community he was engaged in at a particular moment. So I like this example because it shows the diversity of practice, but it also is a good example of one of the more conceptual findings that came out of the dissertation. And that is the idea of data communities. So a data community is a community that is shaped not just by a person's disciplinary norms, but one that forms around, as we can see here, things like shared data pools or similar data needs or data uses. So for example, individuals who are using data science techniques or machine learning techniques, but come from different disciplinary domains, might exist in community with each other around those shared types of methodologies. But having said that, disciplines are important. And the way that we classify those disciplines, both for data and for people and for data work, they matter. So as Christine Borgman points out, although the idea of communities is often used when we're talking about data practices, when we're talking about research data management, this idea of communities is often not really interrogated or poked at, and it usually just refers to disciplinary groups. And these types of disciplinary classifications are important for different groups of people and for different purposes. So for example, in my work, we found that researchers use disciplinary classifications when they're searching for data to use and when they're evaluating data and trying to understand it and where it was created and using which methodologies. Repositories, data repositories, and people who are building infrastructure for data are also developing tools and services like we are doing at DANS, actually, that are based on different disciplinary groups, or policymakers, people who are developing, for example, research data management policies, often do so for particular disciplinary domains. And then, of course, disciplinary classifications are also important for those of us who research them, for researchers of scholarly communication and science communication and research practices, as we try to situate our work with past studies that have also used these disciplinary lenses but we also make use of them ourselves to understand practice. So that kind of brings us in a winding way here to the topic of today's talk, which is really kind of an exploratory talk where I'm wanting to start to interrogate some of these classifications for disciplines that we use when we're talking about data, to really think about how they come about, who is making these classifications, what they actually mean, and maybe what they don't represent or what is left out of these classifications. So to do this, as I said earlier, we're going to look at three, I call them thorny issues, but they're really three kind of questions that I've been considering. And we'll do this from three different perspectives. So by telling three kind of different stories that are drawn from my own very interdisciplinary experience. So we'll start by talking about my own experience of being a researcher sharing data, my own experience of working in repositories and with repositories, and also my experience of using bibliometric techniques in my own research. So that's kind of where we're going. And as I said, it is a very exploratory type of talk. So I really am looking forward to any feedback on these ideas that you have, questions that you have, as I'm just kind of trying to think through this also for my own work. But we will just begin with looking at this first question that I had listed. And that's really to look at what is it that these classifications at a disciplinary level mean when we're talking about data. And the first kind of perspective that we'll use to get into this question is my experience of being a researcher who is sharing her own data. So I completed this survey study, which I mentioned in the earlier section, and I decided that I wanted to kind of practice what I was studying and to document my data so other people might be able to use it and share it in a research data repository. So as I was doing that, I was poking around different repositories, looking at the deposit forms, thinking about where I would put my data, and I was confronted with different disciplinary classifications. So on this screen is an example of the Dryad data repository. And I have to say, this is the current screenshot of their repository. It looked a bit different when I was looking at it earlier. But here in Dryad, there were lots of great kind of open text fields that I could fill in to describe my data. But there were also some more controlled fields, such as this one for research domain, where I was presented with a list of disciplinary domains that I needed to select one of, which we've already talked about, that's challenging for me, to, I guess, describe my data. But I didn't really know here, without any further guidance, what this research domain actually referred to. Was it the research domain of my personal expertise? Was it maybe referring to the domain that described what my data were about? Was it supposed to be used to describe the entire disciplinary expertise of the team that was involved in creating data? So then I continued to look, and it's probably no surprise since I worked at DONTS that I ended up depositing my data in the DONTS data archive. But here on the deposit form, I also found a different disciplinary classification schema. This time it was listed under a field called audience, where I needed to choose from this list that we see here, the scientific disciplines to which my data might be relevant. Now that was interesting and different than what I had seen on the other forms. And it was nice to have this instruction, which I thought was helpful, and the change in perspective was refreshing, I guess. But I also was left with questions and thinking about the assumptions behind this. This assumes that I would know what disciplines might be interested in my data. So that assumes kind of some knowledge on my part about how these other disciplinary domains work and what they're interested in. And we know from past work, including the study that I did on data sense making with Laura Kusten, who's now at the University of Vienna, that researchers have a hard time kind of putting themselves in other people's shoes and thinking about novel uses for their own data. So both of these repositories have these classification schemas. And once I selected one, or in this case, multiple ones could be selected, that disciplinary domain would be associated with my data, and it would become part of the metadata record and be embedded within the repository itself. But I was left with questions, and these types of questions that I was struggling with are not something that would be visible to the end user of the repository. So when they find my data in the repository and tagged with a certain domain, they wouldn't know kind of these behind the scenes questions. Questions such as, what does this classification represent? Does it represent my expertise? Does it represent where the data were created? Is it supposed to be the intended audience? Does it somehow mean what the data are actually about? So I luckily turned to the information science literature, where there is, of course, a great history of examining these issues of classification and thinking about what terms of like aboutness and subjects and disciplines actually could refer to. So I did some reading, and I found this really nice review by Hammerfeld, which I guess is actually quoted on the next screen, where he reviews what the ideas of disciplines, have they been treated, this idea of disciplines within academia, within scholarly communication research. So he comes to the conclusion that on the one hand, and Turner also explains this, we have the idea of disciplines being kind of ways of organizing social systems. So these types of organizations are rooted in shared ways of teaching, or shared ways of solving problems and having solutions to them. So kind of a Thomas Kuhn perspective there. And these shared ways of teaching and shared ways of solving problems are eventually what's used to organize academia into these degree granting institutions and units, such as the one at your university. So according to that discourse, that disciplines are used to organize social systems, Hammerfeld says they should not be confused with subjects or with topics. But, and yet, we see that they're not totally separate. Disciplines are not totally separate also from subjects and topics. And this is a quote from Dewey that also is quoted in that review article, where essentially he says there's no other feature that's more basic of the Dewey Decimal System than the fact that it scatters subjects according to disciplines. So we are left with concluding that disciplines and the classifications of disciplines play kind of a dual role. We're organizing both social systems and knowledge systems, and that these classifications are applied to both people and to content. And so we saw this in the example, the perspective that we started this section of the talk with, the researcher sharing her own data, where the disciplinary classification was applied to an audience for data, so people. But then at the same time, that system gets embedded in the data repository, where it's then applied to the data and is used within the system by other people to understand data, to discover data, for example. We also see that these types of disciplinary classifications are really rooted in these very local contexts, these contexts where the person making the deposit is deciding what the discipline and what the classification actually refers to. So these kind of local contexts are made by the data depositor, but they're also made by repositories themselves, which brings us kind of to our second perspective and our second question here. So repositories are making these kind of local decisions as they're deciding, for example, what classification schemas to even use for disciplines, or what controlled vocabularies to use, and how to present these to users and curators and data sharers. So this second question we'll look at from the perspective then of the repositories themselves, but we'll again start by looking at these two examples with these two classification systems. So at first glance here, looking at the two, we see obvious differences. We notice that the classification system at DONTS is a little bit more detailed. It's also arranged differently. It's arranged so that we can actually see the hierarchy of the schema. The classification system at Dryad is arranged as an alphabetical list, but regardless, the person who is using these systems has some work to do, as they have to figure out, okay, what do I do if my disciplinary domain is not called what I think it should be, so I can't find it on the alphabetical list, or what if it doesn't fit into this hierarchy where I think it should fit? So there's work to do when you're engaging with these different systems. But there are also, going to get back to the idea of these local decisions repositories make, questions that repositories have to work through when deciding why to use the systems that they do. And here I can kind of speak from my own experience again, as someone who has been working at DONTS for a while and has some knowledge of how the repository works. And I can say that from DONTS, the reason behind choosing this classification system here is mostly one of standardization. This is the same system that is used for other DONTS services that DONTS has developed and maintained. It's the Narcissus classification system, which was originally used to classify researchers and institutions. But in order to standardize DONTS services, we use it also for the data deposit form. And this system is somewhat a national system. It was developed by a collaboration of Dutch institutes, as well as DONTS. And it's used very much in the Netherlands, but not so much externally. So there is some work to be done when taking the system outside of the Netherlands. Now, Dryad, on the other hand, uses the OECD field of science classification system for their research domain field. And this is just a recent change. The OECD classification system was originally developed for statisticians who were doing surveys of different research activities in different countries. And I can't speak exactly for why Dryad has this system, but I can put some pieces together, and I'll explain why here. So the OECD classification system has a history of being used by bibliometricians and scientometricians, people who study citation and publication patterns. And Dryad implements the recommendations from the Make Data Count project, which is one of their aims is to investigate data citation. And I know this because they are the sister project or mother project, I'm not sure what the correct relationship would be there, of the Meaningful Data Counts project, which is where I work on in Canada. So as part of the Make Data Count project, they recommend the use of the OECD classification. They see it as being a nice balance between kind of more general and more specific fields, and plus it ties in to this history of being used for studying citation practices. All of this long story to say that these reasons behind adopting the classification systems for disciplines that are used for data are not always straightforward. There are a history behind them, and that history has to do with past research. It has to do with other collaborations that exist. But again, this is not something that we know just by looking at the system itself. Now, these two systems that we just saw on the previous slide are just two of the somewhat dizzying array of different metadata standards which are used to describe research data. And these schemas and standards vary greatly in terms of how detailed they are and how general they are. So there are organizations and efforts such as fairsharing.org, which have begun to kind of bring together these different standards and schemas so that repositories and researchers and people who are supporting research data management can make decisions on selecting an appropriate schema or an appropriate standard for their work. But we can see that although there are really very, very specific metadata schemas like the crystallographic information framework, which has been tagged as being relevant for chemistry and the life sciences, there are also more general metadata schemas such as DCAT or DataCite, which have been developed or adapted from other vocabularies and standards to be used for data. So despite this, really, there are so many. I wish I had a number off the top of my head from fairsharing.org to say there are so many of these different standards. But despite this number and variety of standards that actually exist, we see that the metadata schemas that are actually used in repositories kind of exhibit this long tail distribution. So this graph comes from really an amazing master's thesis that's written by Dorothea Strecker from the University of Humboldt in Berlin, where she undertook to learn more about the metadata schemas that are being used by repositories that are indexed in re3data.org, which is a collection of different data repositories, a list of these different data repositories. So she found that the more general type of repositories are using, in general, more general metadata schemas, and the more specialist repositories and discipline-specific repositories are using these more discipline-specific metadata schemas. We also see that some of these really specific schemas are kind of lumped into this category here, this bluish category of repository-developed metadata schemas with 153, which include things like the Genome Sequence Archive, which has very specific schema developed for their repository, but it's also embedded within the discipline itself. The last thing I'd like to say about this graph here is that and it's something that you might not know just by looking at it, is that according to Dorothea, 61% of the repositories in re3data actually don't say which metadata schema they use. So there's still a lot of unknowns here about which classification systems are being used in general and how these schemas are used to describe subjects and disciplines. But what we can say, and Dorothea Strecker says this in her thesis, but it's also backed up by other articles, that these schemas tend to come together on certain required elements, such as identifier, creator, title, year. These are common elements which are required when describing data, as we see here in this list of mandatory properties from DataCite. We'll notice what is absent from this list, and that would be any type of subject field or disciplinary information. And that is also something that is in line with the other schemas, that subject tends to be a recommended rather than a required piece of information, which can be problematic and is reflected in these results, which come from research out of the Meaningful Data Counts project, which was led by Anton Ninkoff, my colleague, who did a bibliometric analysis of the data sets which are in DataCite. So DataCite is a nonprofit organization which indexes different digital objects, including data from different repositories. And he found that of the 8.5 million data sets in DataCite, there were 6% of them that had information about the discipline assigned in the metadata. So, and there was even less information which had citation information associated with those same data, which is important for our project. So of the 6%, we can, and did, just kind of look at the breakdown of disciplines within that 6%, that small piece of the data. And we saw that there are some disciplinary patterns here, with more data coming from, for example, the natural sciences and the medical and health sciences, and less data being indexed or being tagged with the subject field, since that's also possible, from other fields such as the arts and humanities. So this exercise in the Meaningful Data Counts project of trying to map the different disciplines of the data sets in DataCite got us to really questioning how these disciplinary classifications are even assigned in the first place. And this is an especially important question, and this leads to the third perspective of the talk, for people who use bibliometric techniques for studying knowledge production and communication in science. So bibliometricians and scientometricians, you probably know this, so I'm sorry if this is just knowledge that you have, but they use kind of citation patterns and publication patterns to understand the growth of research fields and the different links between publication and the production of scientific knowledge. So one of the first steps in any bibliometric analysis is really to look for disciplinary patterns, to look for these disciplinary differences. And this is because this is something that has been well documented for many, many years within the field, that people from different disciplinary domains cite different things, they cite in different ways, they publish in different places. For example, computer scientists might prefer to publish in conference proceedings, where humanists prefer to publish in a book chapter. So one of the very first steps in any type of bibliometric analysis is to look for these different disciplinary patterns. And in the Meaningful Data Counts project, we are looking for patterns of data citation. So this was one of our first steps also. And we started by looking at the existing literature that does document some disciplinary patterns in how people cite data. So the 3 studies on this slide used the Data Citation Index, which is a database like the Web of Science. It's run by the same people as the Web of Science, but it indexes data rather than articles. So these works have found that, yeah, okay, there is a bias according to disciplines in the percentage of records in this data citation index. And yeah, there are a tendency to use different ways of referring to data in different disciplines. For example, using URLs rather than DOIs in the natural and life sciences. But looking at this literature, our team is still left wondering, okay, well then, how do we know these disciplines? How does the data citation index actually assign the discipline of this data for us to be able to make these types of statements? So again, we went back to the literature, and after reviewing the literature, we identified 3 kind of primary ways or methods for assigning disciplinary classifications to data. And these 3 methods align with subject classification, I would say, of other things also. So the first would be intellectually, which we saw in the example of the researcher sharing her data, where the data depositor or a data curator will manually assign the disciplinary classification to the data as it's being uploaded to a repository, for example. And this more manual and intellectual approach is laborious. It takes a lot of time, but it's also fairly precise. The next method for assigning these classifications to data is a more algorithmic one, where existing metadata can be worked with machine learning, different machine learning approaches and supervised learning approaches can be conducted on existing metadata, such as where abstracts or related papers to data can be mined for keywords, and those keywords can be matched to existing ontologies to determine what the discipline of the data is, or where you could have a data set within a repository that already has subject headings assigned, and you can use this kind of as a training data set for your machine learning model to then automatically assign other disciplinary information to data that does not have that information. So these algorithmic methods, you can see these are very recent. People are working on this now, and it's difficult to come up with good results. So this is an area of research that is really very, very current, and there's lots of experimentation going on. Then there's the final method, the proxy method, where you can determine what the discipline of a data is based on something else external to the data. So for example, we might say, based on the repository where these data are shared, the discipline of the data is social sciences, for example. And it's this proxy method, which really has a history in bibliometrics and in scientometric studies. For example, where the journal, the discipline of a journal would be taken as a proxy for the discipline of a researcher or the content of an article. And this is kind of what the method is that underlies the findings that we saw in the previous slide about data citation patterns that are using the data citation index. So the data citation index, as I said, it's like the Web of Science. It's operated by the same people who run the Web of Science, Clarivate Analytics. And it indexes data rather than articles. So it brings in data from selected repositories. And as it does so, those data get assigned a category, or rather, the repositories get assigned a category. As the repositories are assigned to one of these Web of Science research areas, which you see on the screen. And these are the same research areas which are used actually in the Web of Science, which were developed based on journal articles. And these are now being applied to classify the repositories and ascertain the discipline of the repositories. So once the data citation index team assigns a discipline to a repository, all of the data within that repository gets that same discipline. So that is kind of the proxy method. And this is the method that was used in all of those previous studies that use this data citation index to take the repository as a signal for all of the, as a signal for the discipline of all of the data within it. So building on this kind of idea of using a proxy to determine the discipline of data, our team at the Meaningful Data Counts project thought that might be a solution to our problem of all of these millions of data sets in DataCite that do not have disciplinary information assigned to them, that we don't know which discipline they belong to. So I'll just end with this anecdote about our own kind of foray into this world of trying to determine disciplines by proxy. So we decided that this would only work for repositories that have a single discipline. They're only biology repositories, or at least that's how they identify. So we spoke with colleagues at re3data.org, which is this collection of different data repositories, and they helped us to identify a list of these single discipline repositories. However, the classification system that is used within re3data.org is different than the one we use on the project. So the one that they use is the DFG, which is the German, one of the German classification systems, which is used to classify research grants and things. So that's the system they use. But the system we're using on the project is the OECD classification for disciplines. So we had to first, before we could do any type of proxy type of association, we had to do a mapping exercise and map these DFG classifications to the OECD scheme. And for some of them, it went pretty well. Mathematics maps very nicely to mathematics, but for others, it was a little bit more challenging. And this took place over many, many meetings and involved lots of collaboration and lots of discussion as we tried to make these decisions. For example, with the case of astronomy. Now, astronomy, for those of us who study data practices, we know that there's lots of work that documents data practices of astronomers, and it would be really great if we, as researchers, could compare our findings to the data practices literature on astronomy. But when you map astronomy to the OECD classification, it maps into being physical sciences. So you lose that level of detail, and we cannot really compare it to that other literature. Now, physical sciences in the OECD classification not only includes astronomy, but it also includes quantum mechanics. So you can see this one classification of physical science includes everything from the atom level, from the atomic level, all the way up into the astronomical level. So we lose some granularity when we do this mapping activity. I really like to end with this kind of anecdote and this example because I think it draws together a lot of the questions that we've been talking about here today. So on the one hand, there's this issue of granularity, that we lose this this local context when we do this type of of mapping effort. It also becomes clear that maybe this classification of physical science doesn't represent what we think it might represent. It actually would represent the discipline of a data repository rather than a data set itself. And then just the third point to think about here is that although mapping to a different classification schema will allow us to compare our results to past work in the field of citation studies, it will also limit us and hinder our ability to compare it to literature in another field, such as data practices, as we lose the context of knowing that a particular data set comes from the field of astronomy. So that was a very long and perhaps discursive storytelling approach to looking at this idea of disciplining data. But I would hope to think that we could at least come up with some kind of conclusions based on these three questions that we looked at from these three different perspectives. And I think the main conclusion that we can reach is that although disciplinary classifications are valuable in that they can provide context for users of data, for repositories, for other stakeholders, they also obscure context at the same time. We see this when saying in the beginning, as we did, that disciplines are important, but they aren't everything. When it comes to data practices are also shaped and formed by things like shared data needs and common data uses. We also see that disciplines play a kind of a dual role, right? They're organizing people and social systems, while at the same time we're using them to organize data and assign things like aboutness to a data set. And throughout this conversation here today, it was very obvious to me is what I always see is this battle, this tension, this tug of war between being general and being specific. The benefits of being general, which allow things like discoverability and comparability and standardization, versus the need to be specific in order to capture local context and meet specific data needs of different users. And then the final point, well, almost final point here on the screen, is that I find that more of this context is lost the further one is from the data and from the point of classification. So starting with the researcher sharing her data was very close to the data and was able to provide more context than the repository was, or than the bibliometrician studying the data. The further the person is away from the data, and the further the person is away from that point of classification, the more context gets lost. And this loss of context and these classifications that we are making have consequences, because we use these classifications to build tools and services and make policies, and they become embedded in our data repositories and embedded in our systems. And then they are normalized, and in a way we also become disciplined or trained to continue to use them and to question them. So that is the purpose of hopefully our conversation here today, to think about questioning them, to see what we can learn about classifications when we begin to interrogate them in this way. So with that, I will thank you, and I look forward to any questions, comments that you might have in terms of how this relates to capturing data and information, or any other things that might come to your mind.